We are looking at the Gospel of John under the title of Good News in Difficult Times. And specifically, we are at a very tender moment in this Gospel where Jesus is spending some intimate time with his disciples. And as we are hearing about the last discourse that Jesus has with his disciples, we come into a very crucial part of the text. But before we go in, a little bit of background and introduction of what Jesus is trying to do here. You too, Brutus. Those are some of the famous lines from Shakespeare's play on Julius Caesar. Some of us have studied this in school and may remember it. Julius Caesar was a brilliant military leader and politician, and his feats were so spectacular that many languages have borrowed his name to mean the word ruler, like Kaiser, for example, in German means king. And Tsar in Russian was also borrowed. In fact, the month of July owes it to his name. He reformed the calendar, which with one slight adjustment is the one still in use today. But despite being such a great king, the way his life came to an end involved his dear friend Brutus being part of the conspirators with the senators to kill him. And he was stabbed 23 times. King Leonidas of Sparta is another epic historic story. We all know how with 300 men, he was outnumbered by the Persians in the pass of Thermopylae until a traitor showed the Persians a way to outflank them. And attacked from the rear, Leonidas and his men bravely fought to the last man in one of history's most famous last stands. We even have a similar story in recent mission history. Don Richardson, who has written the book called The Peace Child, talks about how in one of the tribes in Papua New Guinea, treachery or being a traitor is actually a virtue, where they invite a person from the neighboring tribe to come and feast with them, and once they start believing them, they execute them and revel in that. Bible also has its record of traitors. When it includes Absalom, who is the son of David, and he sought to usurp his father's throne. Along with Ahithophel, David's erstwhile counselor, who joined his rebellion. We read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 10 to 31. When it is your own son doing this, when it's your trusted counselor doing this, is what makes all these stories more intense. And all of these treacheries end in death. But the greatest treachery of all that supersedes all of these is the one we are reading about today by Judas Iscariot unto Jesus himself. And it is in this context, the passage that we have read today comes alive to us because we are seeing something very profound happening that none of these other people could do and none of us can normally do, and Jesus alone can do it. In Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus gives his famous Sermon on the Mount, here is what he says. But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. And pray for them that despitefully use you, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. Jesus was talking about loving your enemies, loving those who hurt us. And we are about to see that exemplified literally by him right now. The passage before this, last week we saw in his washing of his disciples' feet, he demonstrated how we can love those who are dear to us, how we have to serve and care about them. Here, it's the exact opposite. When he knows there is someone who is going to stab him in the back, and he demonstrates tremendous grace and love, and we are going to see that. Loving those who love us is easy, but how do we love those who hate us or who are still hurting us. You know, Leonardo da Vinci's famous portrait of the Last Supper is actually not accurate. You know, he gives this picture of this big table in the upper room and Jesus is sitting with all his disciples. When in reality, in those times, when the supper is happening, the table is there, but there are no chairs, and people are reclining with their head near the table and their feet away, and they are in very close proximity. It's a very intimate moment. And you literally know what's going around, and it's a time where you can see everybody up close. It's not like our Zoom meetings that we have right now where people are side by side on the screen, and you can turn off your videos too if you want so others can see you. But this is a very tender, intimate moment. And it is in that context this wonderful conversation is going on that's deeply profound. We actually don't know a lot about who Judas Iscariot is. He's not like one of the guys Jesus picked and his story is captured. He probably responded to a message that Jesus preached when he preached to the crowds. But what we only know is that his father was Simon Iscariot. We read about that in 4 places, John 6, verse 71, 13, verse 2, and verse 26. And the surname derives from 2 Hebrew words meaning man of Kerioth. That's what Iscariot means. And that suggests that Jesus was from the village of Kerioth, and there are 2 of them. One is in the neighboring country of Moab, which is less likely the place where he came from. You read about that in Jeremiah 48. But more likely, there is one in Judea in the south and south of Hebron. We read about that in Joshua chapter 15, verse 25. Now, what is interesting about this is that Judas, if this is true, which most probably is according to many commentators, he would have been the only disciple among the 12 who was not a Galilean. Galilee is way up north, and Judah is way down. And Jesus picked all his disciples, 10 of them from the north, and Judas was the only exception who came from a completely different place. And therefore, being an outsider in one sense, it made it easier for Judas to justify his treachery in his own mind. It also made it easier for him to hide his hypocrisy, since the other 11 would have known very little about him or his background. And that makes this whole thing very interesting. So I want to talk about 3 things today related to the love of Jesus. First, we want to talk about love of Jesus for his enemies. Second, we want to talk about love of Jesus for God's glory. And finally, we'll conclude with love of Jesus for us, you and me. Firstly, love of Jesus for his enemies. Loving when it hurts, or those who hurt. And there are a few things that go in a wonderful narrative pattern. There is a reaction of Jesus to his statement about who's going to betray him, then the reaction of his disciples, and then the response of Jesus to that, and finally, the last reaction of his disciples. Firstly, the reaction of Jesus to this proclamation, he says in verse 21, after saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. For most of us, and even in these historical cases that I was reading for us at the start, we don't know who will betray us. But Jesus did because of his omniscience, and it troubled him deeply. Now, usually when someone betrays you, the pain starts only afterwards, but for Jesus it started even before because he saw what was coming. But his response was, it says he was troubled in his spirit. The Greek word terasso, it's a strong word which is used figuratively to speak of intense mental and spiritual turmoil. It describes the disciples' terror at seeing the Lord walking on the water in Matthew 14:26. The word used to describe Zechariah's fear when the angel Gabriel appeared to him in the temple in Luke 1:12. It's the word used to describe the disciples' fear when Jesus appeared to them after the resurrection in Luke 24:38. And it's also the word used to describe the deep anguish of Jesus' soul at Lazarus' tomb in John 11:33. Betrayal is never easy. Even for Jesus, this was hard, extremely hard. And now comes the reaction of the disciples, and they go through a range of emotions. It starts with shock and uncertainty, and it moves into curiosity and ends in ambiguity. In verse 22, it says, the disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. They were shocked when they heard this from Jesus' mouth. This is also very remarkable. Not only was Judas hiding it, the disciples never discriminated against him because he was not one of them or he came from another culture. Despite that, they even actually handed him the key role of taking care of the money. And so there was the shock. They could not believe why any of them would do it. And so it moves to curiosity in 23 to 25. We read one of his disciples whom Jesus loved was reclining at the table at Jesus' side. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? And maybe just reading these words doesn't help us to capture what actually is going on. And as I said, they're all reclining so close, and this is a very awkward moment. And so this is a time where people don't want to speak loudly. No, this is not where Peter is sitting across the table and yelling. He's making a gentle motion to John, who he knows was sitting right next to Jesus. And in contrast to Judas, says John was the disciple whom Jesus loved. He never uses his name. So he says, can you find out? Because he knows this is hard for Jesus. And it's probably, perhaps, they say it's a whisper that was done. Now, the response of Jesus is so fabulous. He does two graceful acts to Judas, who is about to betray him. Verse 26, Jesus answered, it is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it. So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Firstly, Jesus doesn't tell his name loudly too. He could have just broken it to all of them. He's the guy that you're looking for. He responds privately to John alone. And John was the only one who knew it was Judas and not the other disciples. And that's why he's able to record it for us. And even in this, Jesus is showing compassion. He wants to protect Judas. He was the one who knew it, and it does not look like he even shares it to anybody else. Because Jesus still cares about Judas. He still cares about the one who he knows is going to hurt him. That is love, my dear friends. To extend to someone not only unconditional, irrespective of who they are, even when you know that they are going to hurt you, to still give compassion. That's the love of Jesus. He still wants to see if there is a way he can melt the heart of Judas. Because we have a God who is a long-suffering God. Perhaps you have walked away from this God. It's been a long time you have gone back to him because of a hurt, because of some tragedy, of some crisis. But Jesus is waiting. He wants to melt your hearts. He wants to draw you back to him. Second thing that Jesus does is phenomenal too. It says, it is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I dip it. The morsel, we're probably not very familiar, those of us who come from rice eating cultures and not Mediterranean cultures. The morsel was a piece of unleavened bread which was dipped into a mixture of bitter herbs and vinegar and water and salt and crushed dates and figs and raisins. So it's a special piece of bread to be given. The morsel by the host was to be singled out for special honor. So Jesus was probably the only one who had that morsel bread, signifying that he is the chosen guest and the head of honor for that evening. And he's saying, the best thing that has been given to me, the only best thing that I have right now, at this very moment, I want to give it to Judas. Not as a sign to expose him, because he hasn't shared it with everybody. He's hoping to show Judas, hey, you are still special to me. You are still valuable to me. And he makes this gesture of honor, showing kindness right up to the very end. Isn't that awesome? We have a God who will never walk out on us, who will never quit on us, even when we are about to walk away from him. He was reaching out to Judas to show him his love and grace till the end, to see if his heart can be melted. And that's sadly why Judas is responsible for what he does. He says in verse 27, then after he had taken the morsel, Judas takes it. He still takes it. It says Satan entered into him. And then Jesus said to him, what you are going to do, do quickly. Must have been so sad for him to make that statement. Jesus was able to perceive Satan now taking control of Judas. The Bible talks about, in your anger, do not sin, and give Satan a foothold. Satan just doesn't enter anybody he thinks he wants to enter. It's those who resist God, those who revel in their rebellion against God, the Bible says, are giving an opportunity for Satan. Why would Judas, who had lived with Jesus for 3 years, who had seen the miracles of Jesus like the disciples, who had heard his teaching, who had seen him coming into Jerusalem as the king, the new king, the gentle king, why would he betray Jesus? Friends, there are many reasons. Perhaps political reasons. Jesus was not the kind of king he was seeing him to be. He wanted a king perhaps who was going to ride in a chariot and take over the Roman Empire and give him a place of power and position. Perhaps there could have been personal reasons of greed and anger. Just before Jesus enters Jerusalem, we saw how Mary was anointing his feet with the expensive alabaster perfume, and Judas got upset about it because he lost an opportunity to embezzle some more money. And that got him mad. The word betray literally means to deliver, to get something out of your hands. The word betray shows up a lot of times in the Bible, and usually it is translated as deliver. It really means to take something off your hands to get rid of your obligations. Perhaps we remember the story of Joseph. He was a great kid, but with terrific giftedness, and his older brothers all hated him, so they betrayed him. They sold their own brother into slavery. They got rid of him so they don't have to listen to his stupid stories any longer. To betray means to take someone and to remove their power over you. They are bothering you so much, you just want to get rid of them forever. You want to do something that obviates that power to take that power out of them. And you know what Judas did? He did not like Jesus. He did not like his power over him, seeking him and others to conform to his holiness. And so he wanted to get rid of him all the time so that he will not feel guilty of doing the things he was called to do. Friends, that is betrayal. And we are going to see in a short moment why it is more relevant to us. You know, the reaction of disciples becomes ambiguity because they still don't know who it was. Just to prove to you that point, in verse 28, it says, no one at the table knew why he said this to Judas. They still didn't think it was Judas because he was just whispering to John. Some thought that because Judas had the money back, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the feast. Remember, it's the Last Supper, the Passover. Or that he should give something to the poor. So they were still attributing the best of intentions to their fellow friend and brother and disciple. So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out. And John records this poignantly. And it was night. Light and darkness are themes that recurs in the Gospel of John and his epistle too. When he says it is night, it is usually something that's so sad and so solemn, and it makes the reader pause. And now he shifts to our second point, where we see another facet of the love of Jesus. We saw Jesus' love towards Judas. Now there was another driving factor for the love of Jesus towards Judas. It was not just about Judas, it was about the glory of God. Love of Jesus for God's glory. Loving our enemies for God's glory. So far, with the attention just being on Judas, why does John suddenly shift and brings this statement? What is the connection? You know, it says, when he had gone, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. You know, as soon as Judas left, Jesus was able to see what's coming. He was looking at the cross. He was looking at his death and resurrection. But now is the focus more clear on who he is about to die for. You see, he was not just about to die for Judas alone, because he was not the only one who hated God or was an enemy. What Judas did is what you and I have done to God ever since we were born. We wanted to deliver God. We didn't want to have God, this whole God talk being put on us. We say, like, I deserve this life, but God did not give this to me or took it away, and so I am angry at him. And I don't want to have anything to do with him. That was true in my own life. I was angry at God because I lost my father when I was 17, 18 years old. And as a family, we had to go through a lot of trials. I did not want to have anything to do with this God. And when I was in college and friends would come to invite me to study the Bible, I would literally run away from him because I didn't want this God to have any presence or power in my life. So Judas is not the only enemy, friends. You and me were also enemies of God. Romans chapter 5 verse 10 says this, for if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, how much more now that we are reconciled shall we be saved by his life? Amen. We were born as enemies of God. We never searched him. We didn't need him. We rejected him despite him giving us all things, and yet he decided to die for us. Even now, every time we choose to remain in anger, every time we give Satan a foothold into our lives to wreak havoc in our marriages, in our friendships, in the church, in the world, we do the Judas thing to Jesus. But Jesus still loves us and takes what is due to you and me upon himself on the cross. This is glorious stuff. This is what legends are trying to be made of. Doing something so good to those who hate us and hurt us. This is what makes Jesus glorious. Not only does he love us in spite of who we are and unconditionally with all our faults, he loves us knowing that we hate him and we don't want his presence and power in our lives. He still chooses to love by giving his life for us. This is glorious love. This is what makes glory. You remember the word glory is weighty. What makes Jesus weighty is this. And then he says in verse 32, if God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. What makes God glorious in Jesus is how his mercy and justice are met in Jesus Christ on the cross, where instead of devouring all his enemies, he is able to put all his wrath on his own son and instead shows us love. That's what makes God the Father glorious, so that you and I could become adopted into his family and we can call him as dear Father, Holy Father. You can't see this anywhere else, friends. There is no other religion, no other philosophy, no other relationship that can give this kind of love to you and me. Not only does Jesus love his enemies by dying on the cross, he also takes them to be where he is. The story doesn't end on the cross, which is heaven. That's another act of glory. That is what he tells his disciples, who will also leave him shortly, right when he needs them the most. And in fact, one of them, Peter, will deny him soon. He talks about that. He says, little children, yet a little while I am with you, in verse 33. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you also, where I am going, you cannot come right now. And Simon Peter asked in 36, Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered him, where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward. Because Jesus is going to prepare a place for them and you and me in heaven. He wants to give us that joy. And he says, in his own instinctive fashion, in verse 37, Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. When he was put to the test, by his own strength, by his own ability which he thought he had, it went away. And that is the same with you and me. By our own strength, by our own abilities, we cannot experience or express his love. And finally comes the last part where Jesus actually gives a command. Love of Jesus for us. He says, this love that I have shown on the cross, this love that I am shown to Judas, is not just something I want to do. I want you to be able to show this love. And he says in verse 34, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. Just as I have loved you, including Judas, you are supposed to love one another. And he gives the reason why. There is a command, and there is a reason for the command. It's not an arbitrary command. And it's not a command that he is giving us so that through that we can earn salvation. He says, the reason I give this command, he says in verse 35, by this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. You know, after washing his disciples' feet, Jesus shared about loving one another. And yet here, in another graphic display of loving his enemies, he's telling his disciples that this is how they ought to love one another. Even when we hurt each other deeply. It's a command. It's not an option. He says, just as I have loved you, including Judas. You know, one of the famous stories I've enjoyed reading and also watching on the big screen was Beauty and the Beast. There are several versions of that, but doesn't matter which version you see. You see there is this person who is a beast, and he looks so ugly outside, and everybody rejects him. And then comes beauty into his life. And all that the beast needed was for his heart to be melted by a genuine expression of love, which beauty does, and he changes into this beautiful prince. You know, when our enemies who hurt us, when they come and say things about us with an intention to destroy us, when we respond in love, that's going to melt their hearts. And it should melt our hearts, because that's what Jesus did to us. When we rejected him, when we delivered him away, when we did not want to have anything with him and betrayed him all through our lives, when he shows us that love that melts our heart. The very first time I remember hearing that there is this Jesus, despite me running away from him, he still was pursuing me. He had already died for me even before I had decided to have him in my life. That melted my heart. I was the beast that needed that love. And when we have experienced that, my dear friends, and when we remember that experience, which is what this whole table is all about, which is why in the communion, when we come together, we do what we do because it's an intimate time. Jesus sees through all our hearts right before we can participate in the Lord's Supper. He can see the hatred we have. He can see the bitterness we have. And he says, if you come to the altar and the gift, and if you have something against a brother, go and reconcile with him first. If Jesus could see through Judas's heart, you think he can't see through your heart and my heart when we hold so many things in our hearts? And because we have received that love, we can give that love to others. And that's why we do confession. Because we see Jesus is watching and say, I'm sorry, Jesus. You made a child of God out of a beast because of your love, even when I was betraying you all my life. And yet I am withholding this love from someone. Forgive me. That is what he wants us to say. That's what he says, love, a new commandment I am giving you. Because he says, give it to others. You know, and the reason he gives is the single biggest apologetic for Christians is loving one another. He says that is what makes a disciple at the end of the day. It's interesting that he did not say, knowing my words will make you my disciple. Praying makes you my disciple. Doing ministry makes you my disciple. While as true and significant and important and necessary all these are, the one thing he says is loving one another makes you my disciple in the eyes of the world, despite our differences, despite hurting each other. Now, one of my favorite apologists is Francis Schaeffer. You know, he is a great apologist, done amazing work in interpreting art and architecture in Renaissance Europe, and I've enjoyed looking at art through his eyes. And this is what he says. He says that love is the final apologetic. It is the defense for which there is no defense. Every other defense we can give for the existence of God, people can come up with all kinds of counter arguments. But the final apologetic is love in this fashion. Loving an enemy, there is no apologetic for that. It is the defense for which there is no defense, my dear friends. And as we close, let me ask you, having received this love, are you giving this love to others? And if you're married, let me ask you, if you're a husband or a wife, are there still long-held hurts and pains that you're holding on to? Words each of you may have spoken to each other, or acts that could have been done. It says, love one another. Let it start from your marriage, the central, closest part of the home. A Christ-centered marriage needs to reflect the love of Christ. And let me talk to parents and children. How is your relationship today? Are you holding on to things that have been said or done or not done? Jesus is asking you to love one another dearly. Or perhaps you're at work. There is this person who's always trying to get you, always trying to dumb you down and slight you by making sly comments and trying to take away your project. Or that friend at school who is always saying mean things about you, or hurting you, or is jealous of you and wants to get better than you. Can you love that person? Because that's the best apologetic. Again, this is the Last Supper. It's communion. I wish we could have done communion together today. This whole thing would have come alive. The Lord sees us. He knows us. And as we close in prayer, before that, I'm going to give us a moment of silence for us to examine our hearts with the recognition that our hearts are bare before God's eyes and He can see us. I probably have shared this before. When we had just gotten Brian and Sophia into our home, and we had to monitor them like a baby monitor that we had in the room, and I had given it a name as a third eye. And so whenever they get into trouble or mischief or have a fight, and I would walk in or call them and say, "What's going on?" And obviously their first answer will be like our first answer, which we still do in God's presence, which is nothing. And then I would tell them, "Well, isn't this what you did to him or her and how you responded to him or her?" And they'll be shocked. "How did you know this, Daddy?" "Because I have a third eye." I'll tell them, "I can see you." And they still believe it, but they're now kind of almost figuring it out, where it's coming from. I can't use that anymore. But right now, my friends, we are in God's presence. He is looking into your heart. We can hide our anger and bitterness from others and put on a smile. We can hide our bitterness from one another, but not to God. If you see something in your heart, confess it to Him. Seek reconciliation. And let's truly love one another so others will be drawn to Christ. And not just loving one another, not just loving people who look like us, even those who are not like us, especially in these times. We are blessed to have a home and a job and food and shelter and clothing, but so many do not. And if God lays it in your heart, let's explicitly show this love to them in action.